Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the University of Scranton's Pedro Arrupe Award Ceremony for 2019. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Father Patrick Rogers, and I'm the Executive Director of the Jesuit Center here on campus. And so before we begin the official program, I'd like to thank the Jesuit Center staff who put this together, and there are a lot of people who helped put this together. So our graduate assistant is named Liam Mooney, and we also have two undergraduate work studies, Virginia Farrell and Jake Brown. And so we want to thank them because they've been working really hard on this. Also, Father Jim Reddington, who's our Jesuit Fellow and Scholar in Residence at the Jesuit Center. We also have great colleagues throughout the university in the President's Office, at Advancement, Media Relations that have been helping out as well. So Mary Beth Smith from the President's Office, Toby Lavecchio from the President's Office, Mary Jane Rooney from the Office of Advancement, Stan Zygmunt from News and Media Relations. These are all folks that have given a lot of time to this event as well. And Elisa Gibson and Jennifer Kresh have also been working tirelessly to make this event what it is and that it runs smoothly. So we want to thank everyone who's been doing that. Now, this celebration would not be what it is without the work of my colleague, Mr. Ryan Sheehan, who is the Assistant Director of the Jesuit Center. His excitement about this event literally begins the day we finish. And so we work really hard, and this is Ryan's baby, so to speak, and he works all year long to make sure that this is just a terrific ceremony, and so we're excited to thank him as well. So we will start with an invocation. So this is given by Kathy Seymour from the Office of Campus Ministry. Kathy.
Good morning. Good morning. I had the pleasure of getting to know Kathy Sprows during my first semester here as a campus minister, which was her senior year. I asked Kathy to lead the search retreat and to give a talk called Christian Living. That talk gives students an opportunity to answer the question, what does it mean to live like a Christian? And to reflect on those in their lives who have been models of Christianity for them. Perhaps that was a precursor to her work on American saints and holy heroes. Let us take a moment to ask God's blessing. Loving and gracious God, we thank you for this opportunity to gather as the University of Scranton community to honor one of our own, Alumna Dr. Kathleen Sprows Cummings of the class of 1993, with the Pedro Arrupe S.J. Award for Distinguished Contributions to Ignatian Mission and Ministry. As a historian of Catholics in America and of women in religion, Dr. Sprows Cummings' work invites us all to a deeper appreciation of the gifts and challenges of faith in American society. We pray in gratitude for the many ways that Dr. Sprows Cummings uses her gifts to educate, challenge, and inspire the faithful. We ask you to continue to bless the work and life of this alumna and scholar, herself a new woman of the old faith, helping us to live lives informed and inspired by those who have gone before us in new ways and new times. And finally, we pray in gratitude for bringing Kathleen home to us, from the campus of Touchdown Jesus back to the campus of the Companions of Jesus, where our football team has been undefeated since 1960. Amen.
Amen. So the University of Scranton created the Pedro Arrupe Award in 1995 to recognize persons or organizations who have furthered in a significant way the vision and mission articulated by St. Ignatius so many years ago. That vision was to seek the magis in all things, and its mission was to set the world on fire with the love of God. The award is named for the late Pedro Arrupe, the 28th Superior General of the Society of Jesus, and someone who has recently been lifted up for canonization. His cause has been undergone. Father Arrupe articulated a dynamic vision of the Ignatian Mission and its ministries for contemporary times. And under his leadership, the Jesuits and all those who serve in Ignatian ministries came to understand afresh their labors as a service of God to the church and to the world. And Father Arrupe expressed in his work and example qualities of spiritual depth, religious devotion, generous service, and a commitment to a faith that acts for justice. So our university community is pleased and honored today to bestow this award on Kathleen Sprows Cummings. This is particularly exciting for us as Dr. Cummings received her bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Scranton and therefore calls this place her alma mater, or dear mother, or nourishing mother. As you will hear with the reading of the citation in just a moment, her scholarship has had a profound impact on the American Catholic Church and our understanding of that church. So, Dr. Cummings and Father Pillars, if you would please come stand here next to the award while the citation is being read, and Mr. Ryan Sheehan, the Assistant Director of the Jesuit Center, will read the citation on behalf of the University of Scranton.
In his famous 1973 address, Superior General Pedro Arrupe, S.J., challenged Jesuit school alumni to live according to a different set of ideals. Quote, "Today, our prime educational objective must be to form men and women for others, men and women who will live not for themselves, but for God and his Christ, for the God-man who lived and died for all the world. Men and women who cannot even conceive of love of God, which does not include love for the least of their neighbors. Men and women completely convinced that love of God, which does not issue in justice for others, is a farce. This Christ-centered drive for justice and helping others was already deeply rooted in Dr. Kathleen Sprows Cummings before she arrived at the University of Scranton. Dr. Cummings grew up outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, with parents who instilled in her a love of service and the pursuit of truth, which is deeply rooted in the Catholic intellectual tradition. Upon her matriculation into the University of Scranton, Dr. Cummings was selected for the Special Jesuit Liberal Arts Honors Program and graduated magna cum laude in 4 years with a BA, MA in History. Dr. Cummings received a MA and Ph.D. in History from the University of Notre Dame, where she now serves as director of the Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism. An uncompromising scholar, Dr. Cummings has written extensively on gender and the ways in which women shaped American Catholic history. Her book, New Women of the Old Faith, Gender and American Catholic Identity in the Progressive Era, was the winner of 3 2009 Catholic Press Association Awards. As director of the Cushwa Center, Dr. Cummings oversees the center's seminars, conferences, and research projects, and her presence in the media is a testament to her pursuit and dedication to providing a strong Catholic voice to those seeking a better understanding of the American Catholic Church and its role historically and in the present age. Dr. Cummings has also taken the necessary position in calling on the Church to undergo radical change in light of the ongoing sexual abuse crisis. Her powerful remonstration of church leadership's handling of the crisis has been a welcome voice for the survivors of abuse as the Church moves forward in hope and reconciliation. Dr. Cummings has dedicated her life to deepening our understanding of what it means to be Catholic and has provided us with an example of how to live up to our responsibility as a Catholic university dedicated to the pursuit of faith and justice in the search for truth. And we are proud that she is one of our own. It is therefore with deep gratitude and appreciation that the University of Scranton bestows the 2019 Pedro Arrupe S.J. Award upon Dr. Kathleen Sprows Cummings.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for this award, which I am incredibly honored and profoundly humbled by. I am delighted indeed to be back on campus, a place I visited almost exactly 30 years ago to the day for the very first time. It's very difficult for me to reconcile what was just read in the citation with the high school senior who was pretty certain that she was headed to a college located a short drive away from the Philadelphia suburb in which she was born. That intention was very much in keeping with what is an innate tendency in me to choose the safe and the familiar paths that were open to me. But as you know, I made a different decision, and one that I consider to be the best one I have made in my life. I don't have to explain to many of you why I made the decision I did, because it's a story you recognize in yourselves if you went here, but in the students that you teach, that there's a moment of setting foot on campus and getting the sense of belonging, a sense of being home. And I remember very well feeling that God was probably calling me to seek him beyond the comfortable and familiar places where I had planned to spend my college years. Part of that recognition all those years ago is owed to Father Bernard McElhenney, sitting right there, the Dean of Admissions at the University of Scranton. I remember sitting in his office with my dad, and Father Mac gently asking me about what I like to do and what I might like to study and what I might like to become. I like to read, I said. I wanted to be successful. I said I'd probably go to law school. I knew a lot of lawyers. I didn't know any college professors. I can only remember fragments of this long ago conversation, but Father Mac talked to me about the kinds of classes I would take if I enrolled at the University of Scranton, particularly if I joined this program with a really weird acronym, SJLA. What did that mean? He told me that I reminded him a lot of a recent graduate who'd received a Truman Scholarship, which involved studying in Oxford for 2 years. He also told me about the University of Scranton's Fulbright program and the amazing record that alums of Scranton had in winning Fulbrights. And he said, perhaps you might want to do something like that. In short, this conversation opened up a world of possibility to me, of avenues that I had not considered. And I had a sense that Scranton was going to change me. And indeed it did, as it has so many others before me and since. My college roommates remember, we talked about it at our 25-year reunion last summer, that their first image of me was someone who was very bookish, who was very shy, liked to kind of stay and read her books and do her own thing. But I became here a person who not only absorbed books, but learned to critique them. A person who did join SJLA and strove to embody that ideal of eloquentia perfecta, to be able to speak. I remember telling Father Ron, and I don't know if you remember this, but you were appalled at the time. I explained that I didn't even really like philosophy at all. And actually, I still don't, to be honest. But I became a double major in it because it helped me ask the big questions, and it helped me integrate fields of discipline which were interesting to me. I took classes about women's history with Dr. Susan Polson, a history I'd never actually really heard of. What was that? A class called Writing Women with Dr. Stephen Whitaker, which opened up a whole new world for me. Many classes with Dr. Parente, who, whenever my students complain that I'm being too harsh with them, I just tell them a few stories about what it was like to be a Parente student and his demanding, unrelentless. In fact, I just brought a copy of my new book for Dr. Parente because he told me several years ago that I should send him all my publications and he would send them back to me with corrections. So I fully anticipate receiving that. When it came time to graduate, I actually did apply for a Fulbright, and I didn't get it, but I learned a lot about who I was through the process, and I also made a promise to myself that someday I was going to expand my horizons internationally. And I didn't wind up going to law school, but chose to enter a Ph.D. program in history because I believed that that was how I could best integrate the knowledge that I had learned here and to write about the past. And as you know, I started to write about the American past, but what that past looked like for members who are for citizens who are members of a universal church based in Rome, but whose faith takes root in a local and national culture, and how that affects their experience. I was always grateful for my Scranton education while I was here, but it's only in retrospect that I have realized just how crucial the Ignatian ideals I internalized while I was here have shaped my life, and that's an ongoing process. One crucial moment in this process happened about 5 years ago when I did the 19th annotation, which is basically St. Ignatius' spiritual exercises spread out over 9 months. I have tried to convince both my husband and employer that I need to go on a 30-day retreat, but so far that is not working. I don't have that space in my life to do that, but this what is sometimes called the retreat in everyday life introduced me to the principles the exercises that I had heard about my whole time that I was here and since. But I actually did them, and one of the many graces I received during the course of that retreat was to see how God had worked in my life, and I kept coming back to that choice I made as a 17-year-old to come here to Scranton. And when I finished the exercises, I really wanted to thank Father Mack for starting it all, because I didn't think I had ever really done that. I hadn't actually seen him much while I was a student here because he was Dean of Admissions. He had gotten me here, and then he moved on to the next incoming class. Now, he and I had kept in touch through one of his dear friends who was a colleague of mine at Notre Dame, and we had a chance to visit from time to time over the years. But my colleague had retired, and I lost touch with Father Mack for just a few years. And so in September 2015, I reached out to my colleague, and I said, "How is Father Mack doing?" I knew he was in his late 80s at that point, so I wondered if he was still active. And could my colleague, could he share his phone number with me, because there was really something I wanted to tell him. My colleague said, "I can do better than that. Father Mack is as spry as he ever was, and he's coming to Notre Dame next weekend for the football game. I will bring him to your office that Friday afternoon." I was delighted, of course, but the timing was somewhat less than ideal, because the next morning, that Saturday morning, I was leaving for an 8-day trip to New York City, where I would be based at NBC Studios providing television commentary for Pope Francis's momentous visit to the United States. And I was a little frazzled. Now, Father Mack and I had a lovely visit, and I said what I wanted to say. Thank you. Thank you for seeing something in a 17-year-old girl that she could not see in herself, and for guiding her to a place that would teach her again and again how to pay careful attention to the moments when God might be calling her to seek more. But toward the end of our conversation, I shared that I was basically a basket case about my upcoming trip. And although I had provided TV commentary before, Pope Francis, I like to say, has been very good for business. There's a lot of interest in him. This was something new. I was spending 8 days at 30 Rock and kind of being on TV all the time. And I said, this is crazy. I mean, it's so scary. What if I get a question that I don't know the answer to? Now, let me skip ahead in this story and say that my worst fears actually materialized. On the third day of Pope Francis's visit, I had been spending long days doing lots of live commentary and of things like the canonization of Junipero Serra, a lot of, I got word that my next taping was for the Today Show. So I went into the studio, and the makeup artist and the hair people just worked their magic. I looked like $1 million, I can tell you. I just looked great. The tech guys had me wired up. I was with my microphones. And the producer said, "Okay, this interview is about Monsignor Mark Myles." "Who?" I said. The producer explained, unsuccessfully camouflaging a look of alarm, that Monsignor Mark Myles was the British priest who was serving as Pope Francis's official translator for the U.S. trip. It turned out that Myles bore a striking resemblance to Stephen Colbert, and he had become an overnight media sensation. Myles himself was refusing to give interviews, so they were enlisting papal experts to provide context. The problem was this papal expert had learned this name about 15 seconds before the cameras started rolling. Did I panic? No. When the camera started and when the interviewer said to me, "Tell me what it's like to be Monsignor Mark Myles this week," I responded in my best papal expert voice that Myles had probably the most important job of the whole visit. For a man like Pope Francis, proximity to the people is key, and yet here he was, being among people whose primary language was one in which he himself was not very comfortable, did not speak very well. So therefore, it was up to Myles to facilitate Pope Francis' connection with the people without disrupting that connection. That was why Myles wasn't giving interviews. He was very conscious that it was not about him. He had to make this connection possible without interfering with it. So I went on in this vein for some time, and this segment was eventually viewed by 7.8 million people on the Today Show. That this experience was a success and not a disaster is chiefly owed to that Friday afternoon conversation in my office with Father Mack. Before we parted, we prayed together, in which Father Mack asked God to be with me in a special way during my upcoming journey. "Keep Kathy ever mindful," he ended, "that all she is really doing is talking about you." It was that prayer that did far more than just calm my nerves, but enabled me to know in that moment that God had called me to the place where I was, and that God would give me the words. Father Mack's prayer that afternoon was an expression of the underlying principle of the spiritual exercises, that God may be found and should be sought out anywhere. It's the source of the world-affirming attitude that is the heart of education here at the University of Scranton. The conversation about Monsignor Mark Myles reminds me of a related principle of Ignatian education that is simply put, staying out of God's way. In the introduction to the exercises, Ignatius counsels the director of a retreat to try not to influence the retreatant or the outcome. It is more appropriate, he writes, and far better that the Creator and Lord himself communicate to the devout soul, to allow the Creator to deal immediately with the creature. This is the source, I believe, and I'm not the first to say this, many people that have said this, that it's the fundamental respect for individuals and their experience as students and colleagues that we see at Jesuit education at its best. And it was at its best here. And so I certainly saw this in the Jesuits with whom it was my privilege to work with. I think of Father Joe Simmons, who died during my junior year here. I think of course, Father Ron, and all I learned through SJLA. But even through my professors who were not Jesuits who internalized this ideal, and of course sitting near Father Ron is Dr. Steele. And I remember when I was deliberating where to go to graduate school, even though Dr. Steele was wearing a Notre Dame tie in every single conversation we had, it was very clear that he didn't just want me to go to Notre Dame because he thought or knew that that was best for me. He wanted me to work this out for myself. Now, one thing I love about the spiritual exercises is that they're called exercises for a reason. They're hard work, and sometimes it involves pain, and it is something that you get better and better with practice. For me, that practice involves an almost daily battle between what remains for me an innate preference for what is safe and comfortable, and an awareness that my most profound encounters with God have taken place in unfamiliar places and in unfamiliar endeavors. One of the guiding principles I return to again and again in my prayer and in my professional life comes from a letter that Ignatius wrote from Rome in 1543. There are very few people who realize, he writes, what God would make of them if they abandoned themselves entirely to his hands and let themselves be formed by God's grace. A thick and shapeless tree trunk would never believe it could become a statue, admired as a miracle of sculpture, and would never consent to submit itself to the chisel of the sculptor who sees by his genius what he could make of it. Many people do not understand, Ignatius went on, that they could become saints if they would let themselves be formed by the grace of God. There's no better embodiment of this principle than Pedro Arrupe, for whom this award is named. And I did not know about Pedro Arrupe while I was here. He died, I believe, in the middle of my sophomore year, and though I'm certain it was announced and obviously was marked in the Jesuit community, I suppose I had other things on my mind as a sophomore. But I've since come to realize that my life and the lives of so many of us were fundamentally changed by Arrupe's definition in 1974 about Jesuit education as forming men and women for others. And as I have gotten to know more about him over the years, I marvel at so many aspects of his life, but I'm really stunned by his well-known final prayer, which was read before the 33rd Congregation of the Society of Jesus after he had been debilitated by a stroke. More than ever, he wrote, I find myself in the hands of God. This was a man who had been eloquent in 7 languages, who could no longer even speak very well his native language. He had lost all of that and so much more by a stroke. But he found himself, at last, he said, completely in the hands of God. This is what I have wanted all my life from my youth. But now there is a difference. The initiative is entirely with God. It is indeed a profound experience to know and feel myself so totally in God's hands. On the same day, Father Patrick invited me to accept this award. Pedro Arrupe's cause for canonization was opened in Rome, something I had been following very closely because, as you heard, I've been writing a book about saints and causes for canonization. I started this project in October 2010 when I traveled to Rome to attend the canonization of Brother Andre Bessette, a member of the Congregation of Holy Cross, the congregation that founded Notre Dame. This was a meaningful trip for so many reasons. For one thing, this visit made possible my very first trip to the Vatican archives. And I have returned there many times since, and the Cushwa Center that I direct has an office in Rome now. So I fulfilled some quarter century later the promise I had made to myself when I did not get the Fulbright, that I would get to engage internationally. But that trip was very meaningful as a faculty at Notre Dame. Now, you may have heard that sometimes there's a spirit of competition that exists between the Jesuits and Holy Cross. Is that familiar to anybody? I can tell you it is especially palpable when it comes to canonized saints. Brother Andre Bessette, a Holy Cross brother from Montreal, Canada, was the very first member of the Congregation of Holy Cross to be canonized a saint. The founder of Holy Cross is not even canonized yet, and of course the Jesuits have many, many saints. Those of us who were representing Holy Cross institutions were cheering very loudly in St. Peter's Square that morning, but we were drowned out by the exuberance of a far larger crowd that was there to celebrate another saint raised to the honors of the altar that day. Mary Mackillop, an Australian sister of St. Joseph in the late 19th century, was canonized, and 13,000 Australians had traveled from across the globe to celebrate the canonization of one of their own, the very first Australian to be canonized. And let me tell you, they knew how to party. The Andre fans couldn't compare. But Mary Mackillop's story became familiar to me on that day. She was a sister of St. Joseph, as I said, in the late 19th century, who publicly exposed a clergy member who was molesting children. The priest was punished, but his cronies sought revenge against Mackillop, spreading slander about her. They accused her of being an alcoholic. They accused her of mismanaging funds. And these accusations, false, eventually resulted in her excommunication. The bishop who excommunicated her eventually revoked that on his deathbed. But for the rest of her life, Mackillop suffered at the hands of ecclesial leaders who, she confided in her sisters, could not or would not understand the community spirit. Mackillop's name was new to me, but the contours of her story were not. To write the history of women in the Catholic Church is to tell the story again and again of how remarkably gifted and faithful women could not get anything done unless they cultivated sympathetic male allies and bowed before or tiptoed around those who wielded immense power. I took an early morning walk through campus this morning, of course visiting some of my old haunts like Casey Hall, where I lived as a first year. But my most meaningful stop was a place that didn't exist when I was here. Last August, as many of you remember, was a dark period in which the Pennsylvania grand jury report was made public, coming on the heels of revelations about Cardinal McCarrick, a man who I'd met personally and actually been utterly charmed by many times. And I wrote an op-ed that was published in the New York Times, as was mentioned, to think about the response. And they were very dark days, but one of the bright spots was that the following Monday morning, when I and all members of the University of Scranton community received an email from Father Pillars informing us that following an emergency meeting of the Board of Trustees, effective immediately, campus buildings bearing the names of 3 bishops implicated in the report would be changed. The residence I had known as McCormick Hall would be renamed Mackillop Hall, to honor the woman who spoke truth to power and risked her own and her sister's well-being, and even the membership in the church she loved, all for the sake of protecting the most vulnerable. As I stood outside of Mackillop Hall this morning, I prayed for a fraction of Mary Mackillop's courage. And I gave thanks once again for being formed by Ignatian ideals. When we are in the zone, Jesuits and those who boast about having been educated by them are not placeholders. We're not wardens of established norms, but those who continue to ask difficult questions about our world, about justice and peace, and about what it means to be a human being. It was the principles I internalized during my 4 years here, more than anything else, that transformed me from a person who hid behind books into a person who writes them. From a girl who struggled to find her voice into a woman who tries to use that voice to amplify the voices silenced in the past and the present by sexism, by misogyny, and by injustice. From a Catholic who was raised to image God as a bearded man who is far away somewhere up there, to a scholar who presupposes that God can and should be found in any arena of human inquiry, and as a believer who knows that there is nothing to be afraid of as long as we have a sincere desire to search for and name the truth. All I have to do is give God the space to stay out of the way and give God's grace, the time to work within me. It is not something I can do alone, and I call on St. Mary Mackillop, and I hope soon to be St. Pedro Arrupe, and all of my mentors in this room, and all of you who work for Jesuit education to keep me ever mindful of that. Thank you so much.
Kathleen, thank you so much for giving us the privilege of honoring you today and for sharing your thoughts with us. This celebration is a milestone in our academic year. Kathleen, I have to say personally, I've heard a lot of talks. I've given a lot of talks on this campus. I have never heard anything so powerful and poignant. So thank you for being with us. We've all heard the phrase, the right person at the right time, for the church in Pennsylvania and beyond. And for me personally, Kathleen is that right person for this time. The time was the release of the grand jury report, as Kathleen mentioned, a report of abuse and cover-ups in Pennsylvania spanning decades. The stories of individual suffering shared in the report were incredibly powerful and painful. They evoked anger, certainly in me and in many others, and were in themselves a desperate call to action. It was in the midst of our collective shock that I read Kathleen's masterful opinion article. Kathleen, you captured so well what I and so many other Catholics were feeling in that moment. Our roots in the church were a mirror of each other. I resonated so well with the church in which you grew up. Like you, and I'm sure many others, I felt challenged to look back now, regardless of my personal experiences of church, with a different eye. Kathleen, you pulled no punches, nor should you have. But beyond the righteous anger channeled through your words, you did something more. You spoke of the holiness that yet abides in the church and always will. And I would add a holiness that potentially abides in each one of us. You also offered words of example for how the church could speak to the shaken faithful and to souls shattered by the sins of abuse and complicity. Finally, you very rightly diagnosed that now is the time for something different than we have seen or experienced thus far in the church's response. How and if we will heed your words is an unfolding story. We are proud today to shine a light on the magnificent work that you have done throughout your scholarly career, and most recently, on the voice that you give to us all in a dark hour. Your call to action was one of the inspirations behind our task force on healing, reconciliation, and hope. Today, I want to commend the co-chairs who are here, Christian Crocus and Patty Tetro, for their work, and commend every member of the task force for your outstanding efforts. You all agreed so readily to be part of this very difficult and sensitive task. The entire university community is grateful to you for your efforts to gather us in reflection and prayer, to give us a glimpse of the pain and suffering of the abused, and to move our own part of the surrounding community and hopefully the entire church. May God bless our speaker today as she continues to ignite and inspire. May God bless our task force members in the important work that they do. May God bless the Universal Church, and as always, may God bless the University of Scranton. Thank you all.
Ryan Sheehan asked me to give the benediction here. I've been working on this for a couple of weeks, about 6-7 pages here. So, but then he just grabbed me and said I should do it in 30 seconds. So I don't know what I'm going to have to cut out. Maybe the Notre Dame jokes. So here's a nice little passage here. Lord, we humbly and happily ask you to bless this gathering, bless us, this food, those who create and serve it. Bless our friends and guests, and please a special blessing for Kathleen, our colleague, our friend, and, if I may, our daughter of Scranton. We ask this in the name of the Lord, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. Amen.
We have a lot of delicious food and good conversation to be had, so please, Manja, thank you very much for coming. God's blessing. Of course. This way, so forget it.
Nobody knows who I'm talking about.